What would you say if you had an addiction that threatened the very foundation of heaven and hell itself? Your propensity to fill your selfish need shakes our very foundation. The story of gambling Hansel gives us childhood trauma manifesting itself into adult madness. Gambling, addiction, vice, lying. With an audience of St. Peter, the devil, and God himself. This is True Crime Fairy Tales, the story of gambling Hansel, an addiction threatening to ruin the very fabric of existence. Let's go. Our story of gambling Hansel continues with him doing what he does best, and that is gamble. It had gotten to a point that he had gambled everything he owned, everything he held dear. It so happens, the day before creditors were to come and take everything that he owned, we get two peculiar guests no one had ever seen before. St. Peter and God himself. He presumes that they are not aware of his impending eviction, but he offers his charity to these two strangers. He tells them, "You're welcome to stay. I don't have a bed. I don't have anything to eat." God says, "Allow us in, and we'll provide." Hansel looks around, realizing there's nothing here but the promise from St. Peter and God that they would provide food was too good of an offer to refuse. Not long after that, they give him 3 coins, and they give him a simple task to go fetch bread from the local baker. Hansel leaves, intent on returning so that St. Peter and God can have food for the night, Hansel included. But old habits die hard, and Hansel notices there is a gathering of other gamblers at a nearby home. The same people who had taken his money time and time again. Seeing another golden opportunity, these gamblers invite Hansel, and they sit around and do what they are known to do. Shortly thereafter, he realizes that he had lost everything again. During this time, St. Peter and God are worried, concerned. Where could Hansel have gone? But he returns and he tells them that he had lost the money, he had fallen, and he was unable to find it in the darkness of night. God, being omnipotent and all-knowing, realized that Hansel was lying. However, he allowed Hansel to keep the lie. St. Peter gave him the same 3 coins, yet this time he followed through with what he was supposed to do. He returns, and God asks, "Do you happen to have any wine?" Hansel says, "All of my possessions are gone. The wine cellar is empty." God instructs Hansel to have faith and to go down to the cellar. Lo and behold, the finest wine Hansel ever had appeared. So Hansel, St. Peter, and God had a very fantastic evening to eat, to drink, and to be merry, fellowship of the most innocent kind. The following day, God gives Hansel an opportunity, and he says, I'll grant you 3 favors. God believes that Hansel will ask for the typical wish: to go to heaven, to have a long life, to live happily ever after, if you will. But gambling Hansel, true to his nature, does not ask for any of these things. Instead, he asks for a pack of playing cards, for which he could win everything. The second wish, he asks for dice, with which he would win everything. Last and definitely not least, a tree. And not just any tree, but a tree with every type of fruit. And once a person climbs up, the only way they can come down is if Hansel allows it. God gives him what he asks for. He and St. Peter leave. Gambling Hansel feels that for once in his life he has everything he needs to be successful at what he does. It's one thing to gamble, it's another to win. He goes about in great earnest to gamble, and with his new tools, it wasn't long before he had gained half the world. St. Peter is watching. He nervously approaches God and says, we can't let this be. Pretty soon, he'll win it all, and you'll lose the whole world. Perhaps we should send Death to put an end to this shenanigans. Death appears, and gambling Hansel had him seated at the gaming table. Death calls out to Hansel, but Hansel says, just a little bit longer. Perhaps while you wait, you can try that tree. All manner of fruit is there, fresh and untouched. Death unknowingly seals his fate. He goes up this tree and is unable to return. All the while, St. Peter and God are watching. With Death being stuck there is not the natural cause of life and death. The cycle is thrown on its ear. Once again, St. Peter nervously approaches God and says, God, this cannot be. Without death, the world will continue. This cannot go on. People would no longer die. We must go ourselves. And they went. God speaks directly to Hansel, commands him to release Death. In the blink of an eye, Death is released, and he takes Hansel. At this point, it appears our story would end, but it becomes far more sinister. When the time came for Hansel to meet his afterlife, it began to get very confusing. They tried the door of heaven, and gambling Hansel said, I'm here, but heaven would have nothing to do. Be gone. So he tries purgatory, and purgatory says, we have nothing for you. There is enough weeping and wailing. We don't engage in gambling. Send him away. The last resort, the door of hell, Satan and his army of demons. It seemed a fitting place for a nuisance such as Hansel. The devil had no clue what had just happened. The great bait and switch. But let us continue. No sooner had Hansel sat down with his cards and his dice, his fail-safe, foolproof plan, he began to win, and he began to take up everything that was in Hades and the netherworld itself. He decides to launch an all-out offensive attack against heaven itself, knocking against the foundation, threatening to throw the very cosmos into chaos. The fear of destroying the fabric of existence weighs heavily on God's mind. Reluctantly, they let Hansel in. No sooner is Hansel inside the pearly gates. He begins to gamble, and he begins to win. And he plays again and again, and there's so much noise and confusion. The very foundation of heaven is compromised. Noise and confusion, the very raucous nature of what gambling Hansel brings, forces St. Peter to come to God one final time. He can't stay. We must cast him out, or he will make all of heaven rebellious. So they make one final move, one final decision with a fiery look. God understands what needs to be done. God knows what needs to be done. St. Peter, God, the Archangel Michael, and a whole host of angels gather Hansel, and they cast him out. He's cast out with such energy, the very essence of his soul shatters. He's cast out with such force, the very fiber and existence of his soul shatters like glass, splinters everywhere. These same bits of gambling Hansel, these same fragments, the very essence of gambling Hansel, the man who threatened to overtake heaven and hell, were cast out with such force, they shattered. He was cast out with such force, such ferocity. His soul broke into countless pieces, countless fragments. These fragments went into the gambling souls who are living to this very day. Let's break this story down a bit more, shall we? It is my belief that gambling Hansel had the opportunity to redeem himself from the onset, but was too blind to see. I find it coincidental that St. Peter and God would show up the very day where he is supposed to lose the last of his worldly possessions, only to offer him the opportunity for everlasting life, peace and prosperity, happiness. The fact that gambling Hansel opted to choose items to help further a struggling career, a struggling ambition, contrary to popular belief, he was gambling Hansel, but he was not very good at it. St. Peter and God gave him many opportunities, and every time he failed. It is my belief that gambling Hansel, with his lifetime of trauma and PTSD, being left in the forest, the gingerbread house, the witch in the oven, the loving father, and hateful stepmother, they show us that even with the past, we have the greatest capacity to make better decisions. And no matter what God and St. Peter did, Hansel chose to make the wrong decision, and hence chose his own fate. This is True Crime Fairy Tale, the story of gambling Hansel, a life of renege, remiss, and ultimate dissatisfaction. This is True Crime Fairy Tales, and we shall convene next time.